Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to April 22nd. This is going to be lecture one. We're going to be probably 2, maybe 3 lectures, but guess what? We are at the end of new content. After this lecture, there will be no more lectures. Friday, you will work on your presentation so that you can turn it in on Monday morning and get ready for your last 30-minute Zoom call with me next week. And then, barring you wanting to take the exam, again, that's going to be up to you. Whether or not you like your grade, I'll be getting some grades put in over the course of the next few days, getting some last-minute things graded for you so that you can see kind of where you're at. Most of you are doing really well, and you're not going to want to take the exam. And if that is the case by mid-next week, you just let me know, and it'll exempt you from the exam. But other than that, we're done with new course content. You have done a remarkable job. Now, I don't know how many of you have watched all of the lectures that I've been posting throughout the remainder of this semester, and I understand it, I get it. I do think there's some really helpful information there, and maybe you'll go back and watch it if you haven't. Probably not, but that is what it is. I do want to applaud you for your work as you've made the transition this semester. This will be my last time really addressing you in this way. So I want to thank you. Thank you for making the transition. I know it's been remarkably difficult. I know that this is not what you signed up for or signed on for. My hopes are that this course in particular has in some way, even in the midst of the transition, added some value to your experience of all of it. I know that it wasn't adequate in terms of what you anticipated when you signed up for the class, but hopefully we've been able to manage and mitigate against too much of a disappointment in terms of the course content. I've really enjoyed getting to know you. I've really enjoyed your vulnerability and sharing your stories, and I really believe in you as you move forward into the future in the different areas that you are going to be serving. And that'll probably be the last lecture, which I'll talk a little bit about vocation and your sense of calling into what you're going to be doing and the difference you're going to be making. So let me start off here with lecture one. I want to follow up with the TED Talk that you would have watched on Monday. So that TED Talk was by Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt is a evolutionary moral psychologist. He's written several great books that I've thoroughly enjoyed. One was called The Coddling of the American Mind. That one was really significant, I think, in terms of helping us understand the lies that our culture has bought into and the fragility that we assume to be the case for young adults. And I just don't think you're fragile. I think you've been met with significant challenges. Part of the story that has shaped your perspective of the world are some of those challenges that both implicitly and explicitly have influenced and impacted your life in significant ways. But he wants to dismantle this idea of fragility amongst young people. But I love this book, The Righteous Mind, because I think The Righteous Mind helps us, at least at some level, get a sense of a framework that we can try to understand why there's this divide behind us and in between us. And this was really, I wanted to hold, my goal for this course, and I'm not going to get into this too much, because we really haven't had a chance to talk about the book Them as much as I would have liked to in this course. And I think that, again, just given the shift and everything that has happened, it just didn't hit the priority list the way I anticipated that it would. But Them offers a sort of another framework by which to analyze this divide, and he talks in terms of social capital and the loss of that social capital and how the connections and tribes that we once used to rely on that made us who we are sort of absent from our lives, and it drives wedges. I think Brene Brown also does a great job of this, talking about this in terms of Braving the Wilderness in that book that she writes, in which she talks about how our assumptions of one another based upon a lack of connectionness often drives the divides. But I really like what Haidt wants to suggest in terms of the moral frameworks that serve as the basis for our divides, because I think it's those moral frameworks that really set the stage for some of the misinterpretations of each other and how we engage one another. And so in terms of those significant shifts, he identifies 5 and then ultimately 6 moral frameworks. And what he wants to suggest is that those moral frameworks serve as the background against which you and I make our decisions about what is right, true, good, and noble. And he wants to talk in terms of care and fairness. Those are the 2 first that he wants to speak about as four moral frameworks. And his suggestion is that liberal progressives tend to advocate more highly for or make decisions based more fully upon this idea of care versus harm and fairness versus inequity, right? So what drives a lot of the conversation for progressive liberals are those first two, what he calls channels, that determine the moral framework in the assumptions that we make about what is right, good, true, and noble. But then he wants to go on and suggest that there's other ones as well. He talks about loyalty, sanctity, and purity, and authority. And he says this is the unique thing. And he makes this contention in the book, The Righteous Mind. He says that conservatives actually operate across all five channels. However, the three channels of authority, loyalty, and sanctity and purity operate at a much higher level than they would ever for liberals, and in fact operate at a higher level often than care and fairness, right? So whereas liberals, he wants to suggest in his book, is that where liberals tend to have a two-channel moral framework, conservatives actually have a five-channel. However, the three subsidiary channels, not care and harm, and subsidiary is not the right word, but the three following, so authority, loyalty, and sanctity and purity, those three have a higher intentionality and respect in terms of the moral framework for conservatives than the preceding two, fairness and care. Not that they're dismissive of those two, because that's part of the empathy that comes with social conservatism and a care for neighbor. And yet, what I think we're realizing that is because of this authority and loyalty in group, who we define as neighbor is at times, has been at times, considered suspect by liberals among conservatives. So they're going to suggest, because you have such a loyalty to in-group, you tend to be dismissive of those who don't fit within your in-group. Therefore, you make moral decisions that are based solely upon the good, what is right, good, true, and noble for your in-group, versus the fairness and equality that should be extended to all of humanity, which is what liberals, progressives tend to want to assert more adamantly. What I want to suggest, rather than getting down the sort of political trajectory that this takes us, is that when we talk about ethics, we need to understand some of the disruptions and imbalances that shape the conversation and discourse that you and I have about what is right, good, true, and noble. And what hate helps us to do is to begin that conversation. I need to understand who it is that I'm having a conversation about ethics with, because their ethical world, their assumptions about the right, good, true, and the right, good, true, and noble is not simply based upon cultural expression or even some of the ethical worldviews and frameworks that we're going to talk about in the next lecture, but they're also shaped by these commitments that they have, these primary commitments that hate would contend have been socially evolved over time as humanity has learned to live in community with one another. We would suggest are embedded in the very life of Scripture. All five of these can be found within the context of Scripture. And we can actually even see, and this is, I don't want to get too far tangentially here, but some of the divide that exists between the priests and the prophets in the Old Testament have to do with these very things. Priests tend to be very concerned about loyalty, authority, and sanctity and purity, whereas the prophets tended to be concerned much more with care and fairness. And so the divide that we get between priests and prophets and the criticism that happens there is actually rooted in Scripture. And what I love about the video that he talks about is that we actually need, as humanity, a balanced approach as to the moral frameworks that shape how you and I engage one another towards the pursuit of the right, good, true, and noble. So even beyond just simply talking to us about the divide itself, Jonathan Haidt then goes on to suggest to us that there is within these channels the capacity and the opportunity for us to explore how we can leverage the benefit of each of these channels for the sake of human flourishing. And I find that to be extremely helpful in terms of this conversation about moral discourse, about ethical discourse, and about the capacity to pursue the right, good, true, and noble. I'm going to pick up on some other frameworks that we're going to look at in terms of how people make ethical decisions in the next lecture.